There are two steps involved in establishing a fact or an hypothesis about something like the resurrection of Jesus. First, there is assembling your inductive database, and then there is providing the best explanation of that data. Now, when a scholar says, for example, that believer and unbeliever alike can agree that the first disciples had experiences of Jesus alive after his death, that is an inductive datum that needs to be explained. And it is absolutely correct that the vast majority, in fact, universal consensus among New Testament scholars is that the disciples did have these post-mortem experiences of Jesus alive from the dead. That is an inductive datum that needs to be explained. Now the question is, how do you best explain that? And that will then be the next step in the investigation to see which hypothesis best accounts for that fact.
Explain it.
Well, when you consider this life-transforming experience that the disciples had, the question is, how in the world did they come up with this belief that Jesus was risen from the dead? As R.H. Fuller has said, even the most skeptical critic has to posit some mysterious X to get the movement going. But the question is, what was that X? Well, if you deny that that X was in fact the event of the resurrection of Jesus, as the disciples claimed, then you've basically got three alternatives. Either their belief was due to Christian influences, pagan influences, or Jewish influences on them. Now, obviously, their belief couldn't have been the result of Christian influences for the simple reason that there wasn't any Christianity yet. Since belief in the resurrection lay at the foundations of the Christian faith, it cannot be explained as a later retrojection or invention of that faith. But neither can it be plausibly explained from the side of pagan influences. Back around the turn of the last century, scholars in the history of religion school attempted to explain the disciples' belief in Jesus' resurrection on the basis of supposed parallels in pagan mythology. But the movement soon collapsed and has now been largely repudiated by contemporary scholars for two reasons. First of all, the parallels were in fact spurious. There really are no parallels in pagan religions to the resurrection of Jesus. These were simply mythological symbols of the crop cycle as the vegetation dies during the dry season and then comes back to life in the rainy season. It had nothing to do with people actually returning from the dead. But secondly, there's no causal connection between these myths and the earliest disciples. Jews found these myths abhorrent. They knew of them and they rejected them as incompatible with Jewish belief. And therefore, you don't even find any trace of these myths of dying and rising gods in first century Palestine. They don't even appear until around the time of Hadrian. So it would simply be unthinkable that these earliest disciples would sincerely now come to believe that God had raised Jesus from the dead because they had heard about these myths of dying and rising crop deities. Mm-hmm. So that leaves us with Jewish influences. Now, the resurrection of the dead was a common Jewish belief that was widely shared, but the Jewish concept of resurrection differed in two fundamental respects from Jesus' resurrection. First of all, the Jewish concept of resurrection was always a resurrection after the end of the world. It would come on Judgment Day when God raised the dead for judgment. It was never within history. Secondly, it was always a general resurrection of all the people or all the righteous dead of Israel, never of an isolated individual. And what that means is that the disciples, confronted with Jesus' execution and death, would at most have simply preserved his tomb as a shrine where they would perhaps look forward someday to being united with their master again in the kingdom of God when God would raise Jesus and all the righteous dead of Israel from the dead and inaugurate his kingdom. But they wouldn't have come up with the un-Jewish and outlandish notion that Jesus had already been raised from the dead. And thus, if the resurrection of Jesus is not historical, that mysterious X remains a blank. There simply is no credible antecedent historical influences that would cause these men to come to believe in the resurrection of Jesus and to go to torturous deaths in attesting to its truth. The obvious question that this raises is, what do skeptical critics then say? Well, the fact is that they don't know what to say. There is no plausible naturalistic explanation of the origin of the Christian way that is offered by skeptical critics today. They simply admit that we don't know the answer. They are left with nothing but a mysterious X, a blank. And thus, as one scholar has put it, the resurrection seems to rip a great hole in history, a hole which the secular historian is at a loss to plug if he denies the fact of the resurrection of Jesus.